been waiting for patiently. And I do want to thank you for that, is this wonderful conversation that we will have with our headliner, Miss Mira Nair, who does not need an introduction, an acclaimed filmmaker, director, producer, and has, I'm sure we've all grown up watching her films and dancing to all the songs in those films. I think you can't have a wedding in Lahore without monsoon wedding songs here. And then, of course, in conversation on the panel with her will be our very own acclaimed Mohsin Hamid, who has again won several awards for his books. And they're going to anchor the conversation talking about Mohsin's novel that Mira then made into a film. And moderating that will be Bilal Tanweer from LUMS. So thank you very much, and I'd request them to please come on stage.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. It is my great honor to introduce two of South Asia's most pioneering and globally recognized artists, Mira Nair and Mohsin Hamid. While they have collaborated in the past, it is a special moment to have them here in Lahore together again to have a conversation about The Reluctant Fundamentalist, a work that remains a milestone in South Asia and can be regarded as a contemporary classic. We are grateful to the ThinkFest and Yaqub Bangash for making this meeting possible. I first encountered Mira Nair's work in Lahore, actually, at the 25th anniversary celebration of the Friday Times. It was my first introduction to Mira Nair, the person and the filmmaker. And I cannot tell you, I was 22 years, I think, by that time, and I was completely and absolutely struck by the energy that emanated from the stage. Mira Nair's presence was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my life. And I can't tell you, after that, obviously, I've gone on to see her films, learn from them, and I'm still sort of blown away by the whole process of making Salam Bombay, which I think is still kind of mind-blowing. And I think my friend and Zebunisa, my colleague at LUMS, we every semester we talk about, which filmmaker to focus, which storyteller from South Asia to focus on, while designing a series of films. And Mira Nair name inevitably comes up, and so we always end up having a discussion on Salam Bombay. So it's an extraordinary film, and for everyone who have still not seen it, I envy you, and please watch it soon. Mira Nair began her career as a stage actor in India before moving to documentary filmmaking at age 20. Her narrative feature debut, Salam Bombay, won Camera d'Or and was nominated for an Academy Award. She has gone on to direct numerous acclaimed films, including Mississippi Masala, Vanity Fair, The Namesake, and most recently, A Suitable Boy. Beyond filmmaking, she has founded Mirabai Films and Maisha Film Lab, an annual filmmaking workshop in Uganda that nurtures new talent. With Mira Nair is Mohsin Hamid, with whom I have had the good fortune of knowing both as a friend and a collaborator. Mohsin and I teach together every year for the past 3 years, a writing workshop at LUMS, and he's also a supporter of the LUMS Young Writers Workshop. He is the author of 5 groundbreaking novels: Moth Smoke, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, Exit West, and The Last White Man, as well as a collection of essays, Discontent and Its Civilizations. His work has been translated into over 40 languages. He has been twice shortlisted for the Booker Prize and has won numerous awards. Today, we are all here to talk about this book that began its life as a book and then went on to become a film. And I think the book and both the film continue to resonate with the audiences today. So I think a good place to start might be the context of the book, what inspired the book, where you were personally when you wrote the book. You had written one novel before that. It was your own breakout book, Mohsen. So tell us a little bit about where it all began.
Thanks, Bilal. So, The Reluctant Fundamentalist was my second book, and it was published in 2007. Before that, I had spent much of the 1990s writing a novel called Moth Smoke that came out in 2000. And when Moth Smoke was done, I wanted to write something that was very different from Moth Smoke. In fact, once Mahmood, Mira's husband, told me that he felt like, upon reading Reluctant Fundamentalist, it felt like it was written by a different author than the person who wrote Moth Smoke. And I was secretly pleased by this because what I didn't want to do was to try to write the same book over and over. In a way, Moth Smoke was a novel about Lahore written by someone who had spent half their life outside Pakistan. And so it was an insider account of a particular slice of Lahori life, but from a, I guess, peculiarly hybridized perspective. And The Reluctant Fundamentalist was the opposite of that. It was an account of life in the US by somebody who'd lived half their life outside the US. And it began the year before 2001. So, as we all know, September 11th, 2001 were the massive terrorist attacks, which then set in motion the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq and so much else that followed. But before that happened, I was in New York, I'd written Moth Smoke, and I was working on a novel about a guy working a corporate job in New York City, feeling like he was in the service of some kind of financial empire that he didn't want to serve. And he quits his job and moves back to Lahore. And of course, The Reluctant Fundamentalist remains, in a way, that story now. But it was a quiet novel sort of set in a different era. And I gave it to my agent in the summer of 2001, and he said, Mohsin, it's very quiet, and, I don't really, why does this guy feel this tension between America and Pakistan, and, where he comes from, and this financial empire? I don't know if I really believe it. And then a month or two later, the 9/11 attacks happened, and a couple of months after that, my agent said, this book about the Muslim guy who wants to go back, let's talk more about it. But I never wanted to write a novel about 9/11. So I felt that 9/11 had overwhelmed this sort of quiet love story, sort of a story of a breakup, really, that I was trying to write. And for a year, I was sort of stuck, and then I tried to revise the novel, but I kept setting it before 9/11 so that it wouldn't be about 9/11. But then it felt like it was almost like an introduction to 9/11, that you read the novel and then the novel ends and then 9/11 happens. And anyway, the years went by. And at a certain point, it occurred to me that I would sort of need to take on this 9/11 reality, and I wanted to take it on. And I also wanted the novel to sort of simultaneously be set in Pakistan and in America. And so this notion of a frame where a Pakistani man meets an American man in a bazaar just down the street from here, probably less than a kilometer away, and starts to tell a story, which is the Lahore frame. But the story is about life in the US before and after 9/11. That structure came from that attempt to have it be simultaneously a book set here and set there. But above all, in those days, I mean, many people now in the audience, so many of us lived through that time, and it seems obvious. But when I speak at universities around the world, increasingly I recognize that the audience wasn't even born when 9/11 happened. So for me, it feels like, of course, this is, contemporary story, but for many people, it's like, partition or, the 1857 or something. It's some ancient historical moment. So for those of you who are not alive or too young to remember, in 2001 and thereafter, something began to happen where many of us saw this narrative that was articulated by the President of the United States, George Bush Jr., that you're either with us or against us, begin to manifest itself in newspapers, in the general discourse, that that you were either good or bad, on our side or the other side, that you have to take sides. This real flattening of nuance. Now, in today's world, nuance has been so flattened and so crushed that it seems obvious that people would say you're against. I mean, this has become the discourse of the Twitter stroke X world that we live in now. But back in 2001, 2002, it felt new. This sudden flattening of language, sudden, you have to pick this side or that side, this new binary way of thinking of the world. You're either a 0 or a 1. This was new, or it felt new to me. And so I wanted to write a novel that was really about that. And so the novel became a story where Changiz tells the story of what happened to him. This seemingly American interlocutor is listening, never gets to speak. And the reader never knows who to believe. Is Changiz telling the truth? Is he the threat? Is the American the threat? Because the novel was trying to reject this 0-1 binary, reject this idea that, that we can just frame narratives by drowning out one side of the story, and force the reader into the uncomfortable position of trying to judge something without knowing the truth, which of course is what life is actually like. And so that became the novel, and that novel came out in 2007, and yeah, that was the story of how it came to be.
Wow. Mira, बताइए आपका पहला encounter with the novel. What was it like, and what all did it allow you to?
Well, firstly, I'm just so happy to be here. It's taken me a long time. With great relief, I got my visa like 3 hours before I crossed the border. So thank you, Yaqub. Thank you, all the powers that be, to let basically someone who belongs here come home. So thank you. I mean, my Abu came from Lahore, my mother is from Amritsar. I grew up in Orissa, in the east of India, where he was a civil servant, but we grew up with the poems of Faiz. I'm so happy to see Selina here. And we grew up with Iqbal. We grew up, he only spoke Urdu, he only spoke Persian, and my mother spoke Hindi and Punjabi. And I lived in that atmosphere, really, and in those words, and in those lyrics, and in those dreams, really, of the great poets of here. And so it was always a desire to come here, but almost impossible growing up. And until 2005 or 6, I think it was, when Ali Sethi and Najam and Jugnu Sethi invited us, Mahmood and I, to come and speak and talk about Monsoon Wedding in my case, and talk about my films. And it was the first time. And it was a very heady time. I felt like I had come into this walloping embrace of a bosomy Punjabi auntie ji. And it was just amazing. We would speak in Lahore and Karachi, and people would just take us in. And within 1 week, I felt like really that I had come to a place that was mine, And I was deeply inspired, both of the music I heard, the people I met, the dreams, the art I saw, and how different and deeply different the actual experience of being in Pakistan was from what the newspapers said Pakistan would be. People would send me off from America saying, I hope you come back. There this going on there, that going on there. And it was just such a different face of anything we read about or hear about, as you must know. So I came back I lived between New York and Delhi, and I came back deeply inspired and wanting so, with great appetite, avidly wanting to tell this tale of my, not just my experience, but this absolute schism between what one part of the world thinks about the other. And because, like Mohsin, I also know the West. I've lived there since I was 19, back and forth. So I know that there was no dialogue. There was just the monologue. Really, unlike Mohsin's book, the monologue was from the other side. So anyhow, I did not know what to do about this until actually Ali Sethi, who's a dear friend and actually a teacher of mine in music, said, came with a manuscript of Reluctant Fundamentalist. He was an intern at The Nation. And he gave me this unpublished manuscript that was there. It was yet unpublished. And I read this thing and I just said, this is it. I was completely, this is it. Because I understood Changes. I understood the two worlds. I understood being in love with America, as Changes says, and being betrayed by it, as I haven't often felt. And so I immediately, I think I acted very swiftly, right? Mohsin, I called you up, I found you, and I beat a lot of people to it, because a lot of people I meet, even yesterday, I was talking to an English producer and she said, I had tried to get the rights, but you got the rights. Anyway, we got the rights unfortunately, right? We met in London and immediately he seemed to be, giving it to me. And I was very, very, I was completely, and yet this book is a very difficult book to make into a film because it's a monologue, and monologues don't make a film. You got to talk to somebody, and who is the somebody. So once we had the rights of the book, very quickly I actually invited Mohsin to work with us on the screenplay and invent the. I mean, he had invented the character of Bobby, but of the American. But who is he? What does he really say? What does he believe in? What does he? How? Who is he? I mean, because the book is written really almost as a mirror of the society of the audience, of who we belong to. You project your own thoughts, right, onto what is Changes right or wrong. In any case, so this process of adaptation took, in all 3 years. It started with.
Mira,
Sorry.
can I go
Please.
to Mohsen, sorry,
Sorry.
and ask him about the book and this mirroring device, and then maybe we can come back to how you adapted it, because I think that is really
Absolutely.
the heart of the book itself.
I was just trying to speak as long as Mohsin did. Please go ahead.
Mohsen, so at the heart of this book, and I think this was one of the breakthroughs that you came up with this novel, and I think that this sort of, I don't want to belittle it by calling it a device, but this sort of space that you create with your central character that allows the readers to mirror their own prejudices. Whether this person is a fundamentalist or not a fundamentalist, there is no definite answer to that. And this was a very, very, very deliberate thing, and that really lies at the heart of the book. So tell us a little bit about this Changes, who can be read in many, many different ways, and how you sort of created this character.
What Mira said actually was spot on. Mira just said that to feel like that you are someone in love with America or with the West, and also betrayed by America or by the West, is I think such a powerful and almost universal experience, that Changes was born out of that experience. Changes is a character who goes to America, has an Ivy League education and has all these opportunities, and yet finds that a certain price is being demanded of letting go of your own ethical frame, of sort of becoming complicit in things you don't believe in, of starting to say words that don't make sense. Everything is possible, but the price for everything is also everything. And so Changes runs into this. And I think it's an experience that so many people have had. I mean, you go back to sort of, Tayyib Saleh's Season of Migration to the North, or people from this part of the world have been writing about going to the West and having this sort of shockingly intimate and yet repulsive encounter. So Changes is born of that. Changes' story is a story of heartbreak. Somebody who falls in love with the American experience and then finds himself utterly shattered by particularly what he sees after 9/11. And so the book was an attempt to just bring that onto the page. Now, the last thing I'll say about it, so that I don't answer as long as last time, but the last thing I'll say about it is, how do you create a character that lets the reader assemble so much of the meaning. And this comes back to, Mira said it was a difficult novel to adapt. And in some ways that was intentional. Not that I imagined the book would ever become a film, but I thought that books do something different than films. So a film, in a way, creates the illusion of being in the world. You're seeing people, you're seeing places, you feel like the world is in front of you. A book doesn't look anything like the world. What a book does is a book allows you, the reader, to create a world in your imagination. So when you read a book, you're a bit more like Mira is. You're the person who makes the film. And so what I tried to do in the novel was to write this character with lots of gaps. That many instances are not described. There's not that much dialogue. There are many people who don't have names. These are things I would do more and more of later on, but I was beginning to explore this novel of gaps. And so in Chenghez's case, this whole idea of, what is a fundamentalist, first of all, and is he one? Chenghez never does anything in the book that is particularly religious. He has a kind of tribal affiliation with Pakistan, with Islam, with being from this part of the world, but his behavior is not sort of determined by some religious intent in the way that we might think of that. But what Chenghez gets in the novel is a voice. He gets a very particular kind of voice, a very stylized voice that seems almost from the past, very formal, and that creates a certain feeling. And the novel is about using that feeling to have the reader sort of, in a way, manipulate the reader gently into making certain judgments. But that, of course, set up the challenge for Mira, which is, okay, a novel asks the reader to do this, but a filmmaker can't just sort of tell the audience, well, this is all up to you. The filmmaker had to show things. Yeah. And then that became this 3 or 4 year process that Mira was talking about. How do you do that in a film?
Yeah. And not just to inhabit who is the American character that Chenghez is speaking to, but eventually also inhabit the world, the genre of a thriller. Will he or won't he? Is he or isn't he? What will happen next in that sense? So that was tricky. So after working with Mohsin and a young writer Ami Boghani for about 3 years, we then, 2 years maybe, we went to a very experienced writer out of Hollywood.
Take us through that process, where it was like to speak to Mohsin and work, breaking it down into something that can then be turned into a screenplay.
Well, essentially it was who is Bobby? Who is this American? And I really wanted to lean on Mohsin to help us with that so that we didn't invent something utterly separate from the fabric of the book and his thinking, And also we really do come from a similar trajectory of, even growing up. And so I just felt at home with him in terms of inhabiting this character, because if you hand it out to a Hollywood screenwriter from the get-go, it'll be Bobby's film. it'll be the American's film. And that was what was interesting even later when we had the film cast, that never had the financiers seen a film in which A-list Hollywood actors like Liev Schreiber or Kate Hudson or Kiefer Sutherland or Om Puri or Shabana Azmi, all these are really top actors who are considered also very commercial, are all serving this young Pakistani unknown actor at that time. Yeah. It was Riz Ahmed's first international film, in a sense. And, the balance of power was intrinsic in the story and obviously in the film, in the casting. So that, I wanted to preserve that very much. It was not about making it the other person's story, I made a film called Queen of Katwe in 2016 about chess, about a Ugandan young 11-year-old slum-dwelling, bright Ugandan girl who was hungry all the time and wonders why her brother isn't. And she follows her brother one day and he gets a bowl of porridge in a church program that teaches chess, and she gets in for that porridge and ends up being a grandmaster by the end of the film. And it's really utterly true story. And when I was pitching it in Hollywood and different places, one person said, yeah, well, so this teacher comes in and takes on these children who are playing chess. I said, no, 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 it's not about the teacher coming in, it's about this girl, you know. So it's the point of view is very, very critical, right? So hence,
I think that's true of all of your
everything.
work. Yes.
Well, yeah, everything. But if you go the other way, it really would have become Bobby's story and how he found the terrorist in Changiz, right? So that's what we just certainly did not want to happen. Besides the fact that I was also very deeply committed to it being a coming of age story of a South Asian brown kid. You know, we never hear that, we never see that story. And especially the story of somebody like both of us who are rooted in in the subcontinent, but who have gone abroad, young and yet don't really fully want to, you know, never come back. I still don't regard myself as an immigrant. You know, I regard myself as my roots are strong and therefore I can fly. You know, so it's the point of view, right? So you can have Jack Kerouac's story On the Road. You can have so many coming of age story, but there's never this story that I read in Mohsin's book. So I wanted to preserve that, you know. And that's what we did. So first we created Bobby pretty much together, and then we still needed that thriller. You know, we needed that genre that would be well, you could say commercial, but also a way to keep the audience, any part of the world, hooked to this story. And that's when I went to Bill Wheeler, who was very experienced and very progressive and very worldly in his thinking, which is a rare thing to find in America, even before the new guy. And so, you know, so that was what we found. And then we worked together very closely, and yeah, it took about 3 years, and then it took in all 5 years from the beginning of buying the book to the saying action to raise the money for the film, because again, money comes with attitude, and I didn't want to go to Hollywood at all. I wanted to find independent sources who would allow us to make this film as we had, both conceived it, and not to whitewash the film, which could happen in a series of steps that suddenly at the end you may not recognize what is the inspiration that you brought to making this film in the first place. So that was difficult, you know. I can regale you with stories of
Yes,
how
I
we
would. I was
raised
exactly going to ask that. So tell us some of your favorite moments from the
Well-
making of the story. And
well-
Mohsin, I'm going to ask you this after
Now
this.
you're very careful about balance. Um, 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 well, it was enormously difficult because people were terrified. Firstly, by the title, they begged me to change the title, and and I just laughed actually, because it was the title that maybe it's not the most commercial movie title, but that was what grabbed me in the first place, is the Reluctant Fundamentalist. It immediately sets up a mystery. It immediately sets up that question mark. So the title was not going to change. And then, as I said before, it was an international movie that had to be made in America, in Pakistan, in Malaysia, in Turkey. It was all over the place with, again, A-listers. So that means it's a certain amount of money you need. It's not just a domestic film, it's an international film. So how to do that? And we finally found two very, very passionate investors, and the Hamid family. I always stayed with them, and we were like, I was there for the fourth time making music in Lahore, recording and everything. And I remember I was in their living room when I got a call that one of the two investors had simply abducted, mysteriously disappeared. And this was about 2 weeks before the filming began. Farid Ayaz and all of the Qawwals that I loved had already crossed the border from Karachi, from Lahore to India, to start that first 8-minute sequence that we were going to shoot. Liev Schreiber was due any minute. Kiefer Sutherland was already feeding stray dogs in Delhi. Everything was ready to start, and this man left. And it was really devastating. When I went home, my mother is also not religious. When I went home to Delhi, I opened the door from Lahore, and there was this Pandit sitting there with a big trika, and I said, "Mom, what's going on?" And she said, "Bhai, aapka film, bhai, phir se." It was the second time it was going down. So this guy was reading my face, apparently, a face reader, and he was saying, anyway, he told me कि ये होगा, but the कम budget में होगा. लोग admire
He's
करेंगे,
specialized in this kind
which
of
is,
area. Huh?
and then he said, लोग admire करेंगे, which means कि commercially इतना नहीं होगा. And ठीक बातें बोली वैसे, and then but I was stuck with only one investor. So I just summoned up the energy to call that person, and I said, you buy paintings every month for $15 million. You do this, you do that. I mean, can't you just make this alone for an much lesser amount of money? And she thought about it, and the key really was that I got a lot of help from Indian director friend Shimit Amin, who is a great director. He made Chak De India and Ab Tak Chappan and Rocket Singh, and he was a really good director who turned out he was an editor. And because of the school that I run in East Africa, in Kampala, Maisha, he was running Maisha that year, and he said, "Mira, I will edit the film, and let's all do it let's do it in India." So that saved me couple $1 million actually. And so we just tightened our belts hugely, and we had this one investor say yes. But for much less, for almost half the budget that we started on. So actually, when you see Reluctant Fundamentalist, all those countries, including Turkey, Malaysia, Lahore, are all shot in Delhi. And we did 2 days of exterior shooting in Lahore because there was no insurance available to bring actors in. And we did 2 days of exterior shooting in Istanbul. And otherwise, it's just a trick of production. And Nisa Hamid came from Lahore. Those days also, we could travel much easier than now. It's taken me 14 years to get back here, But then I came and did music here and all of that. But Nisa came with all these, political posters and props and pajamas and hats and everything, we did it in a very hands-on manner to make Lahore come alive. And also, as you know, in Delhi, there are still Lahori homes that are really like vividly Lahori. And so I've cornered that market. I'm returning to it because my next film is on Amrita Shergill, who was conceived in Lahore and died in Lahore. And and I'm and this time it's going to be in Amritsar that I'm shooting because I can't, it just breaks my heart that I can't really film here, But anyway, that was how.
Wow, that sounds crazy and amazing. Um,
My hair is all colored. It was actually all white at the end.
You
of
look very
Reluctant
well,
Fundamentalist.
actually, for having gone through this. Mohsin, what was your experience of working on this adaptation?
Can I have some water, please? Thank you.
Yeah, me too, actually. Is there any?
Sorry.
Okay, somebody will show up, hopefully.
With water. So it was very interesting for me because when I first met Mira came to London and we had lunch in Soho at I think at the restaurant of her hotel, and I immediately had this sense of trust. I felt like I could trust Mira with this film, and as a novelist, that was the most important thing, because I never thought or expected that somebody was going to sort of make my novel into a film. What happens is somebody's going to make a film that was inspired by reading my novel. And because they're two fundamentally different forms. And so for that to happen, it's like sending your child to school. It's about you sort of have to just trust that the school will be a decent place and they educate your child relatively well and send them back. You can't be sitting there saying, now teach English like this and maths like this, and they shouldn't have a homework assignment. Although interestingly, in Pakistan now, a lot of parents do exactly that with their kids' schools. But so it was firstly this notion of trust, and then Mira was saying, let me get involved in in helping to co-write the first draft, which Ami Bogani and I did. And then, Mira was staying with us in Lahore, and it was a very, sort of collaborative experience, the whole thing of creating it. But
give us a sense of like what those conversations were like. Do you have any recollection?
I mean, there were interesting things. You know, Mira, for example, she talked about creating the character of Bobby. You know, the American who isn't named and doesn't speak in the novel had to become Liev Schreiber's actual character in the film, and that character had to be someone and believe certain things. But one other thing which Mira told me is she said, you know, we sort of need a third act, and she was talking about that third act being Lahore. And it was very interesting for me because in the film, in a way, the novel has the story of a man sort of, you know, in America and then his sort of crisis and leaving of America. And the third act in the novel, in a way, is the frame of him in Lahore telling this story.
Yes.
In the film, it had to be done differently.
Yes.
And so this third act of creating a family for Changez, that's all sort of sketched in the novel, but becomes much more rich in the film. And so this is, you know, Shabana Azmi's character and Om Puri's character, Misha Shafi, who plays the sister of Riz Ahmed's Changez. All of these characters are being developed, the Shadi scene, the whole thing. And of course, partly this was being done because it was necessary for the project of the film. But partly, I think it was also being done because Mira felt a real love for this world and wanted to inhabit it in the film. You know, when we make our stories, our art, we are doing many different things. But one of the things that we are trying to do is to sometimes express something we really wanted to express. And it was very beautiful for me to watch the creation of this third act, of this Pakistani world in the film, which was suitable to the film and the needs of the film, but also in a way born out of this long-standing love that Mira has for this place. And that was, you know, very charming and very inspiring to watch. And it manifested not just in the characters and the story, but in the music of the film, in the visual language of the film. You know, we were smuggling Pakistani political posters into India when we were shooting these crowd scenes in Delhi. And my sister was terrified that the Indian customs would open up these suitcases and be like, you know, what are all of these, you know, political banners and posters in your suitcase? Like, why are you, you know, bringing this to India? The other thing about it is, in a way, we were working in what was a very different time. In some senses, when this film was made, when Mira was here, which is only 12, 13 years ago, 14 years ago, whatever it was, in some ways, it was closer to the time of partition than to the time of now. Mira could come to Lahore, I could go to India. You know, for each of my books, I went to India for the first time to play football in high school in like 1987 or 88. And I'd been going for 30 years, every few years, each time a novel came out, I would go to India, do a book tour. And for the last, you know, 7, 8 years, I've been unable to go to India. It's almost impossible to get a visa. And a film like this one, which had an Indian director, a Pakistani novelist, you know, cast from India, cast from Pakistan, cast from all over the world, really. You know, America, Ireland, people coming to make this film. It's inconceivable now, almost. Well, not inconceivable, but it just isn't possible in today's world. Just getting Mira to visit Lahore, to come to ThinkFest is next to impossible. So for me, one of the most interesting stories, the last thing I'll say is that, you know, we were in Delhi. This filming is happening. There's Lahoris visiting. There's Riz from London. There's, you know, Kiefer Sutherland and, you know, Liev Schreiber and all these people. Or Liev Schreiber, I should say. Kiefer wasn't there, but there was this sort of party at the end of this whole thing. And the cast and the crew and the focus puller and this person and, you know, everybody is there. And there's hundreds of people involved, like a couple hundred people involved in making a film. And they're all gathered in this neighborhood in Delhi for this party. And it was something just so incredibly beautiful to see. You know, there were Indians, there were Pakistanis, there were Irish, there were Americans, and they'd all come together to make this film, which did something that I think no film up to that point had done, which Mira alluded to, which was, you know, a film with Riz Ahmed, Liev Schreiber, Kiefer Sutherland, you know, Kate Hudson, just to name the American actors. A film like that, Riz Ahmed would be shot dead 30 minutes into the film, you know, historically speaking. It would never be that Riz is the true lead. So the film was really groundbreaking. It was amazing to be part of. And for me, it was a really eye-opening experience because it's the opposite of being a novelist, you know. And Mira, this entire time, is creating a film while managing these 200 people and this finance cut in half, and juggling thousands of permissions and things. It's an incredible thing. For us novelists, it would be like trying to write a novel, while balancing on a unicycle on the wing of an aircraft that's doing like a loop-de-loop above Lahore, in high turbulence. It's impossible. But what she would do would somehow, in this complete chaos, make this thing happen. So for me, it was, a really a life-changing experience just to see that group of people come together. And even though the world we live in now seems so different, the possibility that a film like that could be made, and a tribute to Mira that she made it, was an opening to this idea that we could live in a world like this. If we wanted to, we could live in a world where people from all over could come together and do stuff like this. And even though we don't seem to live in that world now, hopefully one day we will live in a world like that again.
Inshallah. And then the film came out the weekend of the Boston bombings, right? The Boston killings. And the marathon bomber, right? And they thought that I had the secret to understanding who this guy was. So I was on every talk show. I was terrified because I'm not a political commentator really. And say, how did this happen? What was he thinking? And I was just really, I used to, tremble inside.
Did you tell them?
I had my son, who was my political advisor, with me. He says, Zoran, kya bolu abhi? It was like that because they really actually thought that I had the secret to the, and I said, anyway. It did help our box office, but it was an uncanny coincidence. Yeah, I tried my best to tell them in Mohsin terms, but it was really one of those weird things. Yeah, the timing.
But also tell us, how do you reflect back on the film, both in terms of your own filmmaking, but also large in the larger South Asia context. I think we were having this conversation just outside where I think Mohsin said that it's inconceivable for us to think of something like this right now. But I kind of objected to the use of the word inconceivable because you guys have already shown that this is possible, although with great difficulty. But I think that is the task of the artist, right? That we kind of show what is possible and then allow the world to find its way there. And I think that what you have done consistently, I think with so many of your projects is to show that this is possible. So starting from Salam Bombay, like all non-trained actors and what you created was also out of this impossibility. So I think I just want to get your reflections on how do you reflect back on this movie and how it perhaps affected what you did after that and this larger moment in South Asia where we are right now.
Well, in terms of my own films, I have to tell you that it is as difficult today for me to make. It all depends on the choices that you make. If you are just standing in a list of directors who want to make rom-coms about white people, I would be, always working. But the point is, I don't want to do that, never have. And the choices one makes determines how difficult it is. And I'm still, it's lovely to be here and to be surrounded by people who believe and are moved by my work. But it is like a writer. I've been in isolation trying to make Amrita Shergill, the movie I'm going to just about start to make. It's been 4 years, because in the West, people don't know who she is, and they don't know why that they will come to the theater to see this artist whom they don't know about. In the East, they'll think it's highbrow, arty-farty, and whatever, and they'll ask about the language. And Amrita comes from Indo-Hungarian stock. Her mother was Hungarian, her father was Sardar. She studied in Paris, but she spoke Punjabi as well at the end of her life. And so, this film in 4 languages is inconceivable for them to even imagine, So I remember in Reluctant Fundamentalist, the finance was so difficult that one guy, a British financier, slightly pink-faced with a decent amount of alcohol in him, said to me, what everyone believed but did not say. He said, darling, you'll get 2 million from us because if you have a Muslim hero in the center of it, that's what you're worth. And this was an international film of needing much more. And I appreciated finally that someone had spoken the truth that everyone felt but did not say, you know. So it is the same actually when you do, you know, Amrita Shergill today. It's not, the Muslimness doesn't come into question, but in a way it's about, you know, we, you know, it's just the difficulty of choosing a subject that they have no clue about, you know. And so that's for me the perennial problem. And you know, even Suitable Boy, BBC came to me to ask make the film series, and I loved the book so much I wanted to make it, and I did not want anyone else to make it. But I had to reinterpret their own thinking about what the film should be, and we can go into that. But if you want to make something and they also want you to make it, they will slam the budget down to maybe 1/10 of what they would give another person for a opera singer or something, you know, a Western module. So that's the issue for me, and that will hound me forever, I think, because of what I, you know, to do. So now you have to keep pairing cutting cloth to size, but cutting cloth also gives me freedom. So the films you see and that you love, like Monsoon Wedding and Namesake and Salam Bombay and all, no one tells me what to do except myself, you know, and my team, you know. But it's not the money, you know. That's the trick for me. Anyway, that's
No, that freedom is hard earned.
the very it's very hard earned, and I will never, I will only, I will not be rich in the bank account, but I'll only be rich, inshallah, in my work, you know. So that's
We're all richer for it, actually. Thank
that's
you.
fine with me.
Okay, so we have about 20 minutes. We can open up for questions, I'm sure. Do you mind if I repeat the question? So the question is about, from Sarim, is about the adaptation or the possible adaptation of Shantaram by Gregory David Roberts. And that's also a story that Sarim has said was deeply personal for Mira.
No, Shantaram was not deeply personal for me. It's a white man's, you know, fantasy. But I always have this appropriative feeling about stories that are coming from the subcontinent that speak to me in other ways. So yes, they came to me, Johnny Depp's company. He was going to play Shantaram. And I said yes because they also had no clue how to adapt it. And I was working with a pretty interesting writer, Eric Roth. And essentially wrote it with him, but it was a pretty strange. You know, they wanted to build because Johnny Depp's daughter had had a stomach infection when she was shooting in London. They didn't want to go anywhere in the East. They were talking of building slums in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or Bombay, and you know, it was an insane Hollywood big boys network that I lived in for about 2 years while doing this. Long story short, we were ready to go. Same thing. We were ready to go. In the production offices open in Bombay, and the Hollywood Writers Guild went on strike. So it was all pencils down. Anything, all movies stopped until the strike was resolved. And the strike took about 3 months. And meanwhile, Johnny said yes to Pirates of the Caribbean 18 or whatever, the next sequel. So we lost him, and that was the end of the film as far as that manifestation of the film was concerned. They made it recently, but I have not had the stomach to watch it. Yeah. We'll,
Should we get a question from somewhere else? Okay, Mrs. Hashmi, please.
If Amrita Shergill is happening, will Lahore be part of it?
Oh, definitely Lahore is part of it, but only at the end because, as you know, tragically, she came to Lahore only about 4 months before she tragically passed away. So she passed away in Lahore, but she was conceived in Lahore with by her, you know, and so she always believed that, and so that she was conceived in Lahore. Umrao Singh Shergill, her father, met her mother, Marie Antoinette. in Lahore in 1911. And so, but we used to have all that, the chapters of the beginnings and the chapter of the end, but it cannot be a biopic that has every beat, of a person's life. So Lahore in our film is always like sort of the Venice of the East, or the Lahore
Hello.
of the West. But we are in the film. It will be actually not filmed, but filmed in Lahore for the very end, when she finally comes to a community of artists and cultural world that she never had in Gorakhpur, in Saraya, even in Simla. So it was like a mecca of her finally being understood and actually celebrated. But then had this. I mean, still to now, when I think that she died at 28, it moves me deeply, that why did that happen. But so that is in Lahore.
And having read an earlier draft of the script, the Lahore that appears in the film is such an exciting and the Lahore that she came to and lived very briefly and died in was such a dynamic, cosmopolitan, artistically fertile, incredible place. So there may not be much Lahore in the film, but the little that there is a fantastic Lahore.
But it'll be infused with that desire, to get to Lahore. But in the filmic terms, it will be about, last 10 minutes or 15, perhaps.
Okay, another question. They're all men who want to ask questions. Okay.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. So my question is a slightly bit more academic, but there was this conversation about writing a story with gaps and leaving it up to the interpretation of the viewer. So my question for Mohsin is that how do you write a story like that without making it too vague or without making it too ambiguous? And of course, my question for you, Mira, would be how would you translate that into a film? So yeah.
There's no really short way to answer that question. I'll try, but basically, the way I would explain it is that because there are people like Mira who make films, the task of showing us the world in a way that we can see it is being done by a form that is, I think, superior to that task than books. Books have their own advantage, which is they let readers make worlds. And so the way I approach what you just said is I try to pretend it's almost like when you're with your best friend and you're a child and you say, okay, let's play make believe. And this is going to be a pirate ship, this little lawn, and this tree will be the mast of the pirate ship, and those leaves will be the fins of the sharks. And then you begin to inhabit that world. I try to give the reader enough little elements that they can then imagine from. That's how I try to do it. It's a much longer answer, but that's a short version. I'll let Mira take on the task of.
But may I ask, Mohsin, wouldn't you yourself, as writing, know the gaps and then eliminate them, because then you would get into the ellipsis? Wouldn't that happen, or would you not actually know the gaps?
So it depends. Sometimes it's the case of saying, okay, I have my interpretation, and now I'm going to eliminate things to make it open. And it can happen that way. But over time, for me, what's begun to be is it's almost like a way of interacting with the reader. It's like having a conversation. We will all have experienced this. Sometimes you have a conversation with someone, and it's a real two-way give and take, and you're just naturally. Other times, you're having a conversation with someone, and they basically want to give you a series of speeches, and they will pause that series of speeches enough for you to say a few words so they can give the next speech. And I guess what I've been trying to do over time is to actually have it be less determined, that my gaps aren't that I actually know what the gap contains, but the gap. So, for example, in my novel, The Exit West, there was a very intentional decision to not name the main character's mother, who dies in that novel, and she dies in the middle of a sentence that keeps going on. And the reason was because when you say that, that a character called Mother dies, the reader brings to that the word mother. If I gave that character my mother's name, or any name, it wouldn't have the same thing. So sometimes it is that you leave a certain gap that the reader is going to bring their own experience to and fill out in a certain way. Other times you may know or not know. I might have had my own view of what happens at the end of the novel, Reluctant Fundamentalist, but oftentimes it is to leave that gap. But what about for you in terms of, because in the film, we did have a conversation at one point, and you were very clear that you didn't want there to be the open possibility at the end of the film that Chingiz is really a terrorist. That was important to you to signal that that's not who this character was. So do you want to say a little bit about that?
I mean, I think that cinema, to answer your question, cinema is a very potent, sometimes more potent than literature, to create by visual ellipsis, visual cutting, to create worlds, especially for me of exile. You can look outside your window in New York City, and instead of the Hudson River, you cut to your garden in Kampala, and within a second, you are there, and you're understanding the state of being in the seesaw between worlds. It's something you can do so economically and quickly. Ellipsis is the nature of, is the very heartbeat of editing for me. And the other thing is, visual sophistication in an audience is so huge now that you sit around, we used to have these jokes about Film Institute films in India, ke, wo aa raha hai, aur tab aa raha hai. That no longer can happen. I mean, I just don't buy that rhythm, because you can tell and speak of so much through actually very excellent and distilled editing. And that's what I love to do. But with me, because I rarely have the money to shoot and shoot and shoot and then amass this distillation, I have to know that distillation prior. Even with Amrita Shergill, we have now cut, because of money, a 40-day shoot to 25 days. So I have to milk it on every moment, all the time. And I have to milk it. And the other funda I go with, it's a formula for me, is that every scene, and virtually almost every shot, but every scene has to do three things, not just one thing. It's not about 2 plus 2 ke yahan se jao ke wahan aa jao. It's not like that. It has to have that layers of amplification that I can use in different ways in the cutting and in the structuring of the film. So that's how I use. So there's no such thing really as a gap. It's like what Eisenstein said, the dialectic of cutting, the two shots meeting each other has to create a third energy, in a sense. So that's what I really use and love about our craft.
Wow. This lady here. Is there a mic that we can get? We can hear her. Okay, go for it.
Yeah, you're audible.
Thank you so much. Hello, Mira. Hello, Mohsin. Thank you for the really insightful session. I had just read your book in October of last year. So, yeah, it's really, really nice seeing the background of it. My question would be, what would be your advice for a young writer who finds themselves losing their South Asian voice when they write? Because I personally consume a lot of Western art. So I find myself speaking more from the lens of an American, like a white or a black, or a white man or a white woman. So how do you make sure you sound Pakistani and you don't lose that essence? Thank you.
It's a fascinating question.
Great question.
I'd love
Great
Mira to also answer this, because it applies not just in writing in writing text. It's also in every form of artistic production. The short answer I'll give you is, what I often do is I try to create a frame in my books. That the story is being told to someone in some particular context. And that way, I think there's always a frame when we write. And if we don't become conscious of that frame, who are we writing to? What is the purpose of this text? Then we might have an unconscious frame that does what you are suggesting, that you are writing to an imagined reader or in an imagined world, which is just sort of what you default to. But when you give yourself a frame, in Moth Smoke, for example, my first novel, the frame was telling the story of these characters to a judge who was the reader. But the judge is from Lahore. And so the way we're going to talk about all these characters and about Lahore is to a fellow Lahori serving as a judge for these characters. And that gives us a certain way of writing. How would you talk about Lahore to somebody else from Lahore who is serving as the judge of this story? In Reluctant Fundamentalist, the frame was that Chingiz is telling a story to an American. So he is speaking to an American. and he is going to speak, but he's speaking aware of the fact that he's speaking to an American. He might be trying to even manipulate the American. So what I would just say is, when you encounter this phenomenon of feeling that you're not writing in your own authentic voice or writing in a way you don't want to, remember there's always a structure around you that you're writing into. Take control of that structure. Who is this story being told to? Is it being told to your sister, your best friend, somebody abroad, somebody, like, create that thing. You know, once I was on the panel with Juno Diaz, and he said something which really stuck with me. He said, look, you should imagine that you are building a cathedral, and that you, from the outside, you see this is where you're standing and looking at the cathedral, and here's how it looks. Once the cathedral is built, anybody can walk inside and experience the cathedral. So you can have a structure for how you write your novel, imagining that you're writing it to this particular audience in this particular way. Once it's built, anybody can read it. It doesn't have to be that reader. But it protects you from defaulting in your mind to a kind of audience and then sort of writing for that audience in a way that you feel is not true to yourself. So that would be my sort of answer to how I would approach that question. But I'd love to hear Mira, because the pressure in film is even more powerful than literature, because money is driving so much of that pressure.
Well, big funda for me is to refuse to pander, to refuse to explain ourselves in that, oh, the red dot means eternity or whatever the hell. You know, I can't stand that kind of, lecturing and or filmmaking, which is to refuse to explain ourselves as like weird objects that are not you, in the sense that if you've got an American hat on and you want to explain to them. I don't go there. But because I live like this between these worlds, and I really understand what your question, I seek to create in characters and in characterization and in also filming something which doesn't confuse people, but goes to the heart of what I want to say, without explanation, actually. And because I'm a visual artist, I also don't want to overdo it with words. So even though we may start with very wordy dialogue and never explanation, but another way, not explaining, but going another way to speak of whatever the dilemma is at hand, then as I proceed with the film, even with working with actors and certainly with editing, but again, even with working with the actors, I proceed to shave the dialogue off so that you're not reading a subtitled film, but you are actually experiencing the film that is subtitled, but not so wordy that you always just end up reading it and not experiencing the emotion from the screen. So it's an interesting and constant balance, but it does take, I find in my experience, in experiencing this all the time, that I really have, I can almost preempt confusion, and when there's confusion, then then you've distracted the audience when they don't understand fully. So how to find another way to not create that confusion, but also not to explain who we are to them, I also don't think always of an audience, that who am I making this for? That would paralyze me actually quite fully. But because I am a creature of somebody who lives between worlds, I'm already thinking and doing like that, without pandering, but finding another way that is actually cinematic, not any other, to make you feel, actually almost feel before you understand. Yeah, thank you.
There's, which brings us to the end of our discussion. But I just want to end by, this one line by Mira Nair that has stayed with me over the years, which is, if we don't tell our stories, no one will. And I think that's something that you continue to reiterate and live by, actually. So thank you, all of you, for joining us, and thank you, Mira Nair. Thank you, Mohsin Hamid, for being with us. Thank you.